The common wisdom with regards to starting up a successful YouTube channel is to try to cast a broad net to build your audience while still focusing on the topics that interest you. Which is why focusing entirely on a single player story mode in a fighting game may seem like an interesting use of my time. Forget nets, I'm targeting a niche of a niche here. I'm fishing with my bare hands. Anybody who's interested in fighting games already knows that their single player content is infamously bare bones and lackluster with very few exceptions, and thus is very likely to be completely disinterested in the subject. So then, why bother? Well, that's actually the exact reason Street Fighter VI's World Tour mode caught my interest when it was announced. Creating your own character, running around an open world, training under the entire Street Fighter roster, and using their moves in combinations that would otherwise be impossible. This looked like a quality video game all on its own, definitely more than the standard visual novel that occasionally remembers it's supposed to be a fighting game. Plus, I had some personal stake in it too. While I play a good amount of fighting games, one series that never really clicked with me in spite of really wanting it to was Street Fighter. I figured having a low-stakes playground to get a feel for the game would help me get used to this game's somewhat stricter combo mechanics that always gave me trouble in the past, as well as find a character that I want to dedicate more time to later. That was more or less the approach I used to learn Dragon Ball FighterZ, believe it or not, and that was a trash story mode even by fighting game standards, so it's safe to say the bar has been set pretty low. So it shouldn't be too surprising to hear that World Tour clears it easily, even in spite of the lack of a proper jump button. Although, with all those recovery frames on the alternative, it's still probably for the best that you brace for a messy landing. But whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, we start in a training center in Metro City, owned and run by Buckler Security Services, a private military company. So I guess we're a merc? Is that going to be the framing device they use to get us to tour around the world and get into fights everywhere we go? Well, no, actually. Turns out we're just some schmuck who signed up for the basic civilian fitness course looking to find the meaning of strength.
Yeah, gotta say, you're photogenic.
Sounds like the kind of philosophical question that might require a bit more soul-searching than it does weightlifting, but hey, you gotta start somewhere. And I can appreciate the direct approach. It's here that we meet our trainer and first mentor, Luke, as well as our rival, Bosch. He goes to greet us, but gets confused about how to perform a proper handshake. We show him the ropes, and he gets the hang of it after a few more tries. Luke then kicks us out and tells us to level up by beating up random civilians. While we do, we spend some time bonding with Bosch. We get some pizza, and look, we even get matching hats, that's cute. After all that, we meet back up with Luke, and he challenges us to a 2-on-1 fight, no holds barred. Turns out he's way above our pay grade. He's got 2 health bars, does plenty of damage, and doesn't take much in return. Though, honestly, now that I'm reviewing the footage, I'm noticing how absolutely terrible I was at this game when I started. So maybe it's less a matter of stats and more just that I had no idea what I was doing at this point. You can definitely beat him, but it's clear that this is absolutely a supposed to lose fight. This kind of encounter design isn't exactly anything new. Typically, when a game throws you into a fight that you're meant to lose, regardless of whether it's truly unwinnable or not, it's done with the intent of contextualizing your eventual growth in power both mechanically and in terms of player skill. But what I get out of it here is that this is meant to be just as much part of the tutorial as learning how the controls work or being taught about the menus. No matter how good you are at fighting games, you're going to have matches where you feel completely outmatched. You'll lose harder than you thought possible, and there won't be anything you can blame it on but your own skill. But that isn't the end. Pick yourself up and come back stronger. No genre exemplifies this idea to the extent that fighting games do, so implanting that idea in your head through a single player mode that very clearly wants to tutorialize you on all the aspects of the game feels like a smart choice to me. You might think I'm overthinking it, and okay, look, full disclosure, it didn't take me very long to realize that if I wanted to get anything at all out of this story, I was gonna have to try and meet it halfway. And we'll save spoilers for the end, but I don't think half was far enough. Right, so with that out of the way, Luke tells us that this is just the first step in our journey towards becoming stronger, and that we and Bosch should travel the world together and take on all the challenges it throws at us. Bosch, however, hates this idea. So he makes like any good angsty anime rival, and runs off to pursue greater power no matter the cost. Off screen. Yeah, get used to that. From here on, we're let loose and allowed to explore the open world at our leisure. Here, we see that World Tour is structured like an open world RPG. You run around the game's 2 decently large maps as your custom character, talking to NPCs to progress through story events, and battle random enemy grunts by transitioning into, you know, the fighting game part. As you progress, you level up a skill tree, buy and earn new equipment. Pretty much every bog standard RPG element under the sun is present here, and I have some gripes about them, but we'll save that for later. Throughout the campaign, you're also given a variety of side quests from different characters, half of which are your standard spread of explore the map, fight the grunts, fight the strong guy, and nothing, while the other half serve as tutorials for fundamental fighting game skills. Which actually brings me to the first thing I want to talk about, and what I think most people who are interested in this mode would want to know about. Does World Tour teach you how to play Street Fighter? I mean... Kinda? Like I said before, this is a low-stakes, zero-pressure playground, so you have all the time in the world to practice basic execution. And many of the side quests require you having a grasp on certain techniques and ideas to finish them. There's at least one for every single game mechanic or fundamental skill you can think of. From getting a certain amount of hits in a combo, or even just use a super, to getting 3 perfect parries under a time limit, or beating an opponent without getting hit. There's a really good range of challenges here. I wouldn't really call them fun, but they're helpful at best and painless at worst, considering the majority of them are like 20 seconds max. The rest of the side quests are more or less the filler content you'd expect. There are notably a few that feature characters from classic Capcom games like Final Fight and the original Street Fighter, and they are definitely cute nods to the series' history. They're really just more of the same in terms of gameplay, but the extra bit of context of having these characters share their history in this world with you really does a lot to separate them from the masses of, hey, go beat up 5 of this specific enemy and I'll give you a Pop-Tart filler that a lot of quests seem to be. I'd say to skip most of the side quests because of that, but a lot of them unlock new travel locations, and subsequently new mentors, so you're just gonna have to deal with the padding if you want to be able to visit every country. And on that note, despite being called World Tour mode, you're actually only going to be spending 99% of your time in 2 places, America and Central Asia, since those are the only 2 maps larger than a green screen studio. And if that sounds like it could be foreshadowing to a fun twist in the story, then I'm sorry to get your hopes up. God damn it. Sorry about that. Anyway, Metro City and Nishal aren't exactly Kamurocho tier open worlds, but they are decently fun to explore. There are references to everything in Capcom's history in every nook and cranny of these maps, and having grown up a lifelong Capcom fan, I really appreciated that. On top of that, actually navigating the maps is made more interesting by the fact that your terrible homunculus doesn't have a traditional jump button, and instead needs to cross gaps and climb to higher platforms by using actual Street Fighter specials like spiral arrows and shoryukens. I say it's interesting instead of flat out fun because yeah, launching your entire rigid body like an ICBM directly at a single unsuspecting salaryman is certainly hilarious, and there's no denying it's more exciting than a traditional dash button, but it loses a lot of its appeal when, in the middle of a very simple platforming challenge, Johnny Street Fightist gets all tuckered out and needs to wait for the fun gauge to recharge. It only happened a handful of times, but when it did, I couldn't help but find myself questioning why this restriction was even there to begin with. The only real repercussion for burning out in the open world is that you'll start in that state if you get into an actual fight, and while yeah, that's a little bit of a pain, it's not like I'm out here throwing hands with Daigo. Most of these enemies don't seem to understand how blocking works. Locking me out of EXs isn't suddenly gonna make them a threat. Now that's not to say that enemies in World Tour are all just free experience sitting on the side of the road waiting to be SPD'd into oblivion. For a lot of players they will be, but for newer players they make for pretty decent exposure to classic tactics that give most beginners trouble in every fighting game. Enemies that spam projectiles or command grabs or armored moves, enemies that you need to specifically hit with anti-airs or lows. Once again, like the side quests, these enemy types do a good job at covering all the ideas that they need to help newcomers get a grasp on dealing with particular problems. I'm not even joking when I say that the refrigerator is a real standout example of teaching the player through enemy design. It's completely invulnerable while the door is closed. You can't even grab it. You need to wait for the door to open to be able to do any damage. The problem is that it only opens its door to attack, which it does by shooting out fruit at increasingly long range. So you need to hit it as hard as you can as soon as the door opens and before getting hit by the fruit. To complicate things somewhat, getting too close or swinging on the fridge too early will have it put armor through your attack and knock you back by smacking you with the door. So not only do you have to time your attack to hit that opening, but you need to space it properly as well. Boom, there you go. Now you know how to play fighting games. Just picture your opponents as fridges and go win Evo. Easy peasy. Even when an enemy clearly isn't meant to teach any one explicit lesson or test a certain skill, the combat system encourages you to practice proper neutral play with a mechanic called punish time. That kinda sounds like it would be a Bayonetta thing, and I'm sure plenty of people would prefer that, but I think that what we ended up with here is pretty cool, if a bit flawed in execution. So periodically when fighting an enemy and they do an attack that either whiffs or is blocked, they may glow white for a short time. Hitting them in this state will trigger a big dramatic slowdown effect, kinda like counters in Guilty Gear Strive, as well as give you increased damage and frame advantage. Triggering this effect with a special move instead of a normal sends the opponent flying and leaves them stunned for a moment, allowing for a full combo. In theory anyway. Obviously this is meant to get players to practice whiff punishing, and I guess punishing in general. Of course, the only way to get the opportunity to trigger punish time is to have the enemy actually perform their attack in the first place, and this is where I think World Tour fumbles the execution a bit. For a good 80% or so of the fights in this campaign, players don't really have to block, think, or ever stop attacking. And that's not just because most of the enemies are too easy. It's because getting hit doesn't really matter. Failure isn't punished thanks to this game mode's most baffling inclusion, the RPG mechanics. I understand how tempting it must be to couple a story about getting stronger with a set of mechanics that allow the player to visibly grow in mechanical strength, but so many of these options completely undercut the idea of needing to actually improve as a player. Healing items are so powerful and plentiful that I only ever went below half health because I actively refused to use them during fights, which you can easily and infinitely do from the pause menu without risking anything. Anytime I started struggling against an enemy, I figured it was a matter of my numbers not being high enough. So I would leave to go upgrade my clothes and come back to find that, to absolutely no one's surprise, I was completely right. I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to imply that stats equals bad or whatever. I understand it's probably meant to impart a sense that your character has specific strengths and weaknesses in the same way normal characters do. You know, you've got your glass cannons versus your tanky big bodies. That's all well and good. But in practice, what we have is a system that allows your numbers to bloat to a point that they flatten out the difficulty curve by force. And while I'm sure there are some starving Tumblr artists out there who would thank you for the inspiration, Capcom, you'll have a hard time convincing me it was worth the casualty. These problems even extend to the multiplayer, since not only does the potential for a massive level and stat gap mean it's horribly unlikely to find a fair match in avatar battles, but you end up getting so much health that way more matches are going to naturally end by time instead of KO, which is never as satisfying. Really, the only good thing to come out of these systems, as far as I'm concerned, are the part-time jobs that earn you the money you need to spend on them. These taking the form of minigames that test your execution skills. I initially opened this section by promising I'd be brief, only to come back later and realize that I'm incapable of following through with that because this was the single longest paragraph in the entire script. So now, instead of transitioning into this bit with a blatant lie, I've decided to lampshade my own incompetence. It's not bad writing, it's ironic. And if that's a good enough excuse for my high school English teachers, it'll probably work well enough here, right? Anyway, beating up random goons on the street will typically give you all the money you'll need to cover healing items or food for buffs. But when it comes time to upgrade your equipment, you're gonna need a good bit more than Cardboard Kyle's pocket change. So every now and then, you'll need to get a real job. Yeah, I know, it's my worst nightmare too. As I said though, they're pretty alright. Each job available will test a certain aspect of your execution. Making pizzas has you executing different motion inputs in rapid succession. I'd say this one is easily the best of the lot in terms of presentation, though I'm not sure why the inputs need to get revealed as slowly as they do. Honestly, if anything, it makes them harder to read because you spend so much time looking at the incomplete input that you very easily find yourself filling in the blanks incorrectly. It's weird, but it's not so bad that it negates the massive goofy smile I get when at the end of each round the announcer yells, "Viva Hot Pizza!" As for the others, there's a bottle chopping minigame that helps you work through your charge inputs. If you get the input just right, you'll chop through everything all at once, but if you flub it, you'll only get through the first thing you hit. I really like the way this one escalates in difficulty. It starts slow and won't move on to the next set of bottles until you finish the set you're on. But on the harder modes, you need to get the timing and execution just right on every swing in order to keep up with the conveyor belt. There's the board breaking minigame. It's fine, if a bit forgettable. I'd say it's meant to test your agility and the accuracy of your aerial attacks more than anything else, but if that's the case, the way it's implemented is kinda counterproductive. Typically in a real match, you'll want to input jumping attacks as low to the ground as possible so that the time between your attack landing and you getting to act again is as short as possible. That way you maximize your frame advantage and thus your viable follow-up options. Here though, you need to time your attack to hit only the boards and not the people holding them, otherwise you get punished. That's not really a bad thing. It's a fine minigame. It's just not a particularly useful skill to carry over into the main game. There's the basketball parrying minigame making its return from Third Strike, though depending on how much you care about going for perfect parries, the difficulty for this one can be all over the place. Back in Third Strike, parries had a variable timing window depending on certain conditions like whether or not you're airborne, ranging I believe between 5 and 10 frames. Even at the lowest end, that's not so bad, and for that version of the minigame, I'm pretty sure every parry was a 10-frame window. Here though, you can either parry everything for free just by holding the parry button, or you can go for perfect parries by tapping it at just the right time. And the window for this is a minuscule 2 frames. Because of that, I usually end up getting hit by like half the balls. Finally, the last minigame is breaking down different vehicles into scrap metal, a Street Fighter classic. You could probably argue that this is meant to push you to figure out how to output as much damage as possible in a short amount of time or something, but I never really felt pressured by a timer or anything, so as far as I'm concerned, this is just goofy fun. So once you've had your fill of the wage slave life, it's time to head back to the nearest clothing shop to go ahead and completely nullify any challenge that the game might throw at you for the next few hours. After that, you can go ahead and spend any money you have left over on gifts to simp for your mentors. Traveling around the world to interact with and train under all the different Street Fighter characters really is the main selling point of this campaign. And while some might be kind of disappointed that none of them are actually involved in the plot in any way, it does provide the somewhat unique opportunity of getting to see what these characters are like in a zero-stakes environment. This ended up being a pretty big highlight for me. The dialogue you get as you increase your bond with them is really nice, really fleshes them out as characters. And the cutscenes that introduce each new mentor do a great job not only of establishing their individual personalities, but also selling their strength, legitimizing their place in the roster. I have never spared a thought for E Honda before in my life, but I'll admit, seeing him step into the ring with my character and grow into a towering, immovable wall was actually pretty hype. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's still a bastard, and there's a special place in hell for everyone who plays him in ranked, but you know, it was a cool moment. Cutscenes and dialogue are boring though, you don't care about that. You want to know what combination of moves you can equip to your character to evolve them from freak show to war crime. As you level up a mentor's style, you're given access to their normals, special moves, and eventually their supers. You can pick any character's fighting style and have up to 8 slots for specials and 3 for supers, 1 for each level of meter. You can slot in any combination of the lot of them with one restriction. You aren't allowed to duplicate motion inputs, regardless of the button those inputs are tied to. That means only 1 quarter circle forward, 1 quarter circle back, etc. As you can see, I very much had a theme going with my build. I needed as much spinning as possible, but there was one problem. Since I can only have 1 quarter circle back special, I can't have both Luke's Flash Knuckle and, say, Ken's Tatsumaki. That sucks because Flash Knuckle is cool as shit and really fun. So I had to make this one concession for the sake of having more fun combo routes. That restriction effectively prevents you from fully copying most existing characters' movesets. Not only does this mean that you need to experiment to find combinations that work and make sense, since you can't just be Orange Ryu, but it also means you have to step out of your comfort zone and try new motion inputs to get full use out of your moveset. A point that I feel is reinforced by the fact that the second set of special moves that you unlock are both charge inputs. Of course, that's not exactly why that restriction is in place, I imagine. No, the real reason you can't have duplicate motion inputs is because of modern controls, Capcom's latest take on a more accessible, beginner-friendly control scheme. I'll make this quick because it's not really a part of World Tour mode specifically, but it is kinda neat. Simpler control schemes in fighting games have been a go-to solution for making the games playable for newcomers for a long time now. Hell, just off the top of my head, Ultimate Marvel 3 had them and that game's 12 years old now. The problem with these control schemes has historically been on the side of the execution, somewhat ironically. They tend to focus more on automating play rather than actually simplifying control. And while, yeah, mashing one button to do combos or supers or whatever is simple, it's not really playing the game if you aren't actually making decisions. Modern controls in Street Fighter 6 seem to be the best implementation of a beginner control scheme so far because they achieve that goal via translation as opposed to automation. Now hold on, try to relax. I know that depending on who's handling the translation, this can be a slippery slope.
Which managed to succeed in transporting Yamcha into another dimension.
But give Capcom a chance here. They've gone and condensed Street Fighter's classic 6-button control scheme down to 4 buttons. 3 for normals and 1 for easy specials, so you can use them without the motion input. The result is a set of controls that still feels and plays like Street Fighter. You got your footsies, your sweeps, your anti-airs, all that, but it's easier on your hands. Yes, there are auto combos, but they're separated via an assist button that you need to hold down to perform them, so you aren't sacrificing the ability to actually play neutral to have them. And even new players should be able to tell that they aren't optimal in the slightest, especially since they force you to spend resources. Once they're more comfortable with the system, they'll naturally want to learn how to use their resources on their own terms, both by learning proper meterless combos and stronger extensions to make the most of what they do burn. That's all great. Giving newer players the tools to jumpstart the learning process and properly engage with the game's core systems is something that I can always get behind. But let's pivot back to World Tour proper now, because this ties back to what I think might be the game mode's biggest oversight. This game seems to do everything in its power to try to teach you how to play Street Fighter, and yet, ironically, it never seems concerned with teaching you how to play your character. Each mentor you train under throughout the course of the story will give you all of their moves, but never at any point will they offer even a shred of advice on how to use them. Which moves are my best pokes? What's a good combo starter? What are my target combos? The baffling thing is that all this information is in the game somewhere, but it's never presented at the one point where it would be the most helpful. Each of the characters has a guide that teaches you these things that's even written in the respective character's voice, but you can't access them in any way through World Tour mode. Instead, you need to read through your move list, either in the start menu during a fight or in the status menu while selecting a moveset. And since the majority of enemies drop dead in 2 hits, you're not going to be able to experiment much outside of training mode. It's such a shame because as much as this game does to encourage you to experiment, I always felt hesitant to stray away from what was comfortable because choosing a new fighting style always meant navigating through like 3 different menus just to find a handful of tips to point me towards my best buttons. Then heading back to World Tour to see how well my current special moves mesh with my new normals. Finally, after making any necessary adjustments on that front, only then do I actually feel in any way ready to get back to pile driving mimes into the sidewalk. It's not the end of the world to have to do all that, especially if you only plan on playing with a single moveset. But I'm sure you can imagine how much of a pace breaker that can be every time you want to try something new. I really don't see why some form of these character guides couldn't have been worked into the mentor system in one way or another. Each character you train under regularly offers to spar with you as you level up their style. Just have a few snippets of their respective guides show up at the bottom of the screen during those fights and frame it as them giving you advice while you spar. From there, all you need to do is make the option to spar against them always available as something the player themselves can initiate instead of having to wait for the mentors to randomly offer it at certain levels. I don't think that's a perfect implementation or anything, but it would definitely be better than the fuck it figure it out yourself dickhead approach that the game goes with right now. So then, you have nearly full access to every character's moveset so you can experiment and see who does and doesn't click with you. You're actively encouraged to try every different input through both minigames and the built-in limitations of character customization, and many of the side quests teach you about things like whiff punishing, anti-airs, and so on. All this sounds pretty good. Gripes aside, World Tour is a pretty fun way to learn the game. And even if you're already good at Street Fighter, the opportunity to mess around with a custom character is pretty novel for this series, so I'd say it's worth it just for that. So is that it? Are we done here? Well, not quite, since oddly enough, in spite of World Tour ostensibly being the story mode for Street Fighter 6, we haven't really touched on any sort of narrative since the very beginning. An approach I decided on less to avoid spoilers, but you know the drill, clear out if you care, and more because it mirrors the game's attitude on the matter. This campaign operates via a cycle of losing Bosch, beating up everyone we're pointed at, being given information about where to find Bosch, and actually finding him for like 2 minutes before the cycle begins again. That is isn't the biggest problem in and of itself. It's a fighting game, so you need an easy excuse to fight lots of dudes, that's fine. The problem starts with the realization that the people you're fighting are almost never in any way related to your ultimate goal, and the absolutely nightmarish consequences that fact has on the story's pacing. Outside of maybe 3 fights in this 25-hour campaign, you're beating the teeth out of gang members, con artists, mimes, fucking Roombas, all of them busy work until the game is willing to throw up its hands and say, fine, Bosch is in England, go find him, I guess. Whoops, hey, there he goes again. Guess it's back to the daily grind for you. And while that's weak as all hell, it could possibly be excusable. Even at the worst of times, it's not bad enough to be offensive or anything. No, it's only when we get to the ending that it all comes together like your soft, squishy face and a baseball bat that's covered in hornets that are on fire. In the final few chapters, we meet with Bosch's comrades in the resistance of his home country. They tell us about their plot to use a bomb to assassinate the showrunner of the next big tournament we're going to. They replace the championship belt with an explosive replica, so Bosch is going to enter the tournament, win, and detonate it during the closing ceremony, sacrificing himself for the cause in the process. We don't like that, so we run off to try to disable the bomb while it's still in storage, whereupon we're interrupted by a ghost. Enter Johann Petrovich, JP, the big bad evil guy that we've only just met now in the literal final hour of the game. He talks about how stupid and shitty the belt is before shooing us away, leaving actually winning the tournament as our only option for keeping Bosch from blowing himself up and subsequently making our entire journey pointless. So we do so. We fight through a shockingly lackluster lineup of jobbers until we meet Bosch in the grand finals. What follows is actually an excellent final boss fight. He's strong, fast, and has a moveset that's been evolving over the course of the game, serving to display how our respective growths and strength run parallel to each other. Once you beat him, you take your place on the podium and the award ceremony begins. Okay, so let's back up for a second here. Heading into this final chapter, we have 3 important plot points that need resolving, right? The first is the most obvious. We've been trying to track down Bosch all game. Turns out he's juicing on turbo lean or whatever, and now he's got superpowers that are threatening to turn him into a mindless raging monster forever. So we've got to see if we can restore his humanity somehow. Of course, it gets revealed in the second to last chapter that he's been a literal goddamn suicide bomber this whole time, and yeah, that sucks, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that there could still be a good way out of this whole mess. That ties into the second unresolved issue, that being the conflict between JP and the Resistance and Nishal. Now, it's never actually stated what JP is doing that's got the Resistance pissed off in the first place. We know that he's using this tournament to launder money, but aside from that, all we have is the vague idea that somehow he's to blame for the Nishal government enacting some completely unspecified radical policies that people don't like for some reason. Basically, here's the bad man. Trust me, he's very bad. He needs to be stopped. Finally, there's the question this whole story opened with. What is the meaning of strength? Now obviously the game isn't just gonna spell it out. It's supposed to be a thematic thing, you know, figure it out yourself. Thing is though, that up to this point, as far as the main plot is concerned, all that's really happened is the main character blindly doing whatever they're told to do regardless of who's giving the order. And then things just sort of work out, usually out of pure contrivance. That doesn't really sound to me like a good way to deliver a message on the meaning of strength. In fact, it's kind of the exact opposite. So this ending had better figure something out fast, or this will all have been a huge waste of time. Okay, are we all on the same page? Great, so now let's get our answers. What happens to Bosch? Well, turns out after kicking you out of the storage room, JP inspected the belt and found the bomb. He activates the countdown timer and hands it off to Bosch's little sister, who just so happens to be there, instead of presenting it himself. Bosch goes berserk, snatches the belt, and runs to throw it off stage, leaving only himself in the blast radius when it goes off. Meaning he's now dead, and it's your fault. Shit, okay, well what about JP? Well, you beat him up, but this is Street Fighter. He's probably gotten his ass kicked even worse in the past, and it's not like that stopped him from becoming a literal supervillain. Why would this be any different? Okay, fine then. What's the meaning of strength? Ah, that's the neat thing. There is none. What the fuck even happened here? Why would you write a tragic ending for a story that didn't bother establishing, much less developing, any of the characters? What's the takeaway here, Capcom? Don't help your friends, fight for change, or even bother getting stronger because you can accomplish just as much, if not more, with an infinite supply of Red Bull? Obviously, I'm being somewhat hyperbolic. Throughout the course of the campaign, the player meets all of the Street Fighter characters and, from those meetings, learns their perspective on the meaning of strength. be it inner peace, the ability to fight your own battles, or even just as a form of expression. It seems pretty clear to me that this ending is meant to challenge whichever perspective you, the player, latch onto the most personally by contrasting it with nihilism. Strength is meaningless. That's all well and good in theory, but then throughout the final scenes, the game goes and reinforces that nihilism not only through cutscenes, but gameplay as well. You're supposed to lose to Bosch. His super move is clearly designed to break through your defenses and dish out an absurd amount of damage. And since it doesn't cost any meter and is completely invulnerable on startup, there's no way to prevent him from using it. So you lose, you see him die, and you might think, damn, if I was stronger I could have won and gotten the good ending. But then you go back and win because, in all honesty, his super move is actually really easy to punish once you see it a few times, and nope! Bosch is still dead. Sorry, strength is meaningless. Then you go and fight JP because fuck a proper climactic boss fight. Let's throw hands with this old guy that we just met. Yeah, he's strong, but as it turns out, unlike so many other story fights, you aren't allowed to lose. The game isn't saying prove me wrong. It's saying you must be this tall to ride. You beat him, he collapses, he laughs at you. Strength is meaningless. Roll credits. Like, am I being dumb? Is there more value to this ending than the spit JP left on my shoes before heading back to his billion-dollar estate to snort purple crank off M. Bison's corpse? Maybe this is meant to serve as the campaign's real final challenge. Is your conviction in your belief strong enough to push back against the apathy and cruelty of what seems to be all of reality? After all, this is a fighting game. The most important skill one needs to improve at these games is the ability to learn from loss. Could it be that by forcing the player to face this reality of their abject failure, it seeks to prime them for failure to come, to make them stronger and better able to handle not only the trials of ranked play, but those of life itself? No, you fucking idiot, it's just a bad ending. Get over yourself.